Probably very similar to the election cycle that we just came through. Jesus was holding rallies at all these different towns and villages that he was coming to, getting his message out. Message of the good news and of God's reign. Going from village to village, town to town, synagogue to synagogue, Jesus was teaching about the kingdom of God and performing all sorts of miracles. And along the way, he was stirring up a good bit of curiosity with just a touch of controversy. And as his reputation preceded him, there was always a crowd waiting for him at the next town, at the next village, at the next synagogue. Hearing that this teacher, this new teacher with a good word was coming to town, people would come to see what he had to say, to see what he would do next. Some came wanting to hear what he had to say, to judge for themselves if he was the Messiah that had been promised, while others came needing something more than just a word. They came needing a healing, either for themselves or for someone they loved. Because after delivering his famous Sermon on the Mount for 3 whole chapters, Jesus spends the next 2 chapters doing healing after healing, cleansing a leper, casting out a demon, healing a paralytic, raising a girl from the dead, restoring sight to 2 men born blind, and calming a storm just for good measure. We haven't even gotten to his miraculous healings. Miracle after miracle. It was a pretty rigorous schedule for one man, even with a growing support staff. But it seemed that no matter how hard he worked, no matter how many sermons he gave, or how many parables he told, or how many people he healed, there was always more. More that were coming, more that were waiting, more lessons to teach, more sicknesses to cure, more people to feed, more storms to calm, more demons to cast out. And we realize the magnitude of this work in our short gospel reading this morning. Being told that Jesus had traveled from town to town and village to village, we see him stop. And at the sight of all the crowds before him, crowds that kept coming needing more, we see Jesus stop. And he looks out on them and he sees how they were distressed and how they were dejected, how they were hurting and how they were suffering, and he has compassion for them. Seeing how they kept coming, he famously observed how the harvest is bountiful, but the laborers are few. Seeing the greatness of the need before him, and yet knowing he was just one person, confined to one place at one time, Jesus went on to instruct the disciples to beg the overseer of the harvest to send more laborers out to bring in the crops. But our reading didn't end there. I had us read that next verse. The first verse of the next chapter, in which Jesus summons the 12 disciples, empowers them to do all of the things that he had been doing, curing the sick, casting out demons and whatnot. And he gives them instructions. For the next chapter or 2, he instructs them about where to go and how to go from there to continue this great work, to spread the good news of God's reign. I had us read this next verse because I think it's funny that Jesus first asked the disciples to pray for more laborers, and then almost within the same breath appoints them to be those laborers, calling them to be the answer to what he had asked them to pray for. It's the original version of the bumper sticker platitude, be the change that you want to see in the world. Because if you pray for God to change something, know that you might be the one called to make that change. To change the world in a myriad of big and small ways. Seeing the greatness of the needs in the world, Jesus gave the disciples the power to do the hands-on work of the kingdom. The intimate work of healing and restoration. Because if you think about it, unlike the sermons and the parables that could be given en masse to the crowds, healing was always done through a personal connection. It was always hands-on and face-to-face. Because that is what it means to be the hands and the feet and the face and the heart of Christ in the world today. Jesus was just only one person, confined to one place at one time, but the needs of the world are more than one person can attend to. Which is why Christ calls us to have compassion on our brothers and our sisters, on the foreigners and the orphans and the widowed. That's why Christ calls us to let compassion direct our action, to let our hearts be broken, but our hands be busy. Well, during my 4 years of college, I was fortunate enough to hear a good number of interesting speakers that came to campus. But it wasn't long before I started noticing a trend as I would go to these speakers. After hearing some remarkable person talk about their remarkable work, or after learning about some complicated problem in the world from some leading world expert, someone in the audience would inevitably raise their hand during the question and answer period and ask the question. And I took to calling it the question because somehow someone always asked it. One of my brave fellow students, moved by the words of the speaker, would always raise their hand and ask, what is it? What can I do? And it was an honest question, one that troubled my own mind as well as my understanding of the world. As I grew and changed, that question continued to echo. A question that still troubles me from time to time today with so many things that seem out of my control. What can I do in the face of so many things? Faced with the needs of the world, what are we to do? It's a question that's been present through our conversations over the past several weeks as we've considered what it means to be those good stewards. To be those stewards of everything that God has entrusted to our care, from creation to our bodies, from the past to the present and the future, from our finances and beyond. With everything that we have, with everything that's going on, what are we to do? And it would be so nice if we were given specific step-by-step instructions or simple answers, which is what I think my fellow students were wanting in that moment in college, wanting an easy answer, something that would make it easy for us to say, sure, I can do that. But living the answers to the question isn't so much about following a specific set of instructions as it is about following a specific example. The example of Christ, the one who had compassion on the crowds, the one who healed their sicknesses and cared for their needs. We're called to have compassion and to let that compassion direct our action, to take care of each other, because that's what it means to be like Christ. Thankfully, Jesus didn't have a God complex. He didn't feel the need to be the only one capable of changing the world. Instead, he was all about calling God's people to join in the ongoing work of redemption and restoration. Jesus was all about empowering and equipping and encouraging us all to go and do likewise. Now, for those of you who don't know, today, if you're not a liturgical nerd like me and some other folks here, today is technically the last day of the year, according to the liturgical calendar, because the world begins anew and everything resets as we start into Advent, a period of waiting with hope and expectancy. And as the last day of the year, today is what's known as Reign of Christ Sunday. Not the rain that's happening out there, but the rain that's spelled with a G. Reign of Christ Sunday. And it's a day that calls us to take strength in the face of adversity and courage in the midst of discouragement, as we're reminded that the world Christ envisioned is present with us, is present among us and in us. It's present between us. It calls us to remember that we make real the love of Christ. We make real the reign of God and the good news when we're moved with compassion. And we reach out between the spaces that divide us to care for our brothers and our sisters, the foreigners, the orphans, and the widowed. Today is the last day of the year. And as is the general tradition at the beginning of a new year, I suggest that we consider making some resolutions for the year to come. Now, if you've already filled out a stewardship card, you've already begun to think about ways that you can have an impact on the world, ways that you can be that good steward. So in this season that calls us to give thanks, let us also consider what we can give out of our compassion. To consider how we're being called to care for the needs of the world, to heal, to cure, to cast out demons, to be stewards of the gratitude that we have for all that God has done for us. As the final installment in our focus on stewardship, let us continue to assess and figure out what it means to be a steward, to be that steward of gratitude, to give thanks by letting our hearts be broken for the world that God created. Both scriptures that we read this morning were about the harvest. It seemed a fitting theme coming off the feast of Thanksgiving, where we ate too much. First, in the book of Deuteronomy, we had a literal harvest in which the Israelites were instructed to leave a portion of their harvest for the widow and the orphan and the foreigner. You see, it was an act of compassion and a check on their greed. Their greed to wring every last ounce of profit from their fields and their orchards and their vineyards. Don't go over it twice, the scripture said. Leave what is left for the foreigner, the widow, and the orphan among you, because remember where you came from. Remember what I have done for you. Have compassion. And the second, not so literal but still significant harvest was just as much about compassion as the first. In comparing the needs of the crowds to a harvest, Jesus invites us to join in and to do our part. See, as laborers of the harvest, we're not responsible for the whole thing. We're just called to do our part, to tend to the plot or the row or the portion that has been entrusted to us. Over the next few weeks, there are several opportunities to labor with Christ in our own community. I mentioned most of them at the beginning of the service. They're in the announcements in your bulletin. First, as John mentioned, there is the food pantry. If you would like to volunteer, like I said, a small group of us will be taking on giving volunteer support on the 5th Thursday starting this week. And if you can't go this Thursday, but you would like to go another day, or you like to be involved in the future, please come talk to me. Because there is work to be done with people behind the scenes. There is a task for you. The second opportunity is Christmas sharing. As many of you know, this is a ministry that our church has been part of for almost 50 years. And starting next Sunday, we'll be setting up tables in the basement. Or I think the table's already set up, but we'll be starting to organize all the donations and setting everything up and sorting through it. And if you're interested for helping out at any part of that, there's sign-up sheets in the back. You can talk to Pam, maybe. I'm sure she has all the answers. Talk to Pam or to Connie or myself, and we'll get you connected somehow. Another opportunity, like Sue said earlier, is the Agape cookie sale. If you like to bake, there's never such a thing as too many cookies, right? There's never such a thing as too many volunteers. We'll need help setting up on that Friday night, and if you want to help give out cookies on Saturday, I'm sure we could take the help then too. Another opportunity. The harvest is bountiful, beloved of God. There are opportunities everywhere. Another one is with our SE ministry. If you didn't know, every Tuesday morning a local grocery store donates all of their baked goods for all of our SE sites. But those baked goods need to be picked up and delivered to the SE office. It just takes an hour or two out of your day. If you'd like to sign up for one of those shifts, again, let me know. The harvest is bountiful, but the laborers are few. Let us not let the harvest suffer for lack of labor. If none of these opportunities appeal to you or work for you, then I pray that you follow the pull of your heart and you let Christ's compassion show you where your labor lies, where you are most needed to bring the reign of Christ into the world, to make the good news real. As recipients of God's enduring grace, I pray that your compassion be transformed into action this season and beyond. May you be Christ's heart going out into the world. Amen.